Hello, y'all. I have a really weird pondering to share with you today while I cut out some birds. I was cutting out the birds for the bum 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 for my Beethoven's Revenge collage piece. Oh, there's tea all over my desk. Okay, but I didn't like the colors. They didn't show up. I was using a very light green on top of an even lighter green, and it was almost invisible. So we're doing this again. And I'm going to be cutting out these 4 birds on all these different colors of paper. Actually, let me tell you about what these different colors of paper represent, because they can each represent something different in the context of my piece. But at the same time, I want them to show up and look good. So we have the blues. In the piece Beethoven's Revenge, the darker blues represent war. This is like a milder form of conflict. This blue, the dark blue, is like all-out war. This is just regular, run-of-the-mill conflict. It's everywhere. It's all the time. And then we have, this fun one. This is conflict mixed with peace, with reconciliation, with hope. That's what the orange in the Beethoven's Revenge represents, is hope and optimism and joy and all of the good things in life. So this is pretty much pure joy, pure hope. And here you see it emerging again from the blue. So the hope and the joy coming out of conflict. And here it's a little less conflict, a little more joy. Here it's a little more conflict, a little less joy. The lighter blues represent just a status quo of a peaceful life. So they would represent a return to a peaceful life. And the greens represent a new life. So it's a new form of peaceful life. It is the new world that we are fighting for. So that when we emerge from an old status quo to a new status quo. Oh, look at that. From old to new. But in the middle, between old and new, we've got conflict. We've got some run-of-the-mill conflict. We've got some all-out war. Things like that. See? This is how we get from here to here. I know, that was probably really, really abstract, but, you know, I'm a symbolist artist, so that's what happens. We get abstract around here. In fact, I never finished cutting these out, so I'm going to finish cutting these out. And then we're going to see what looks the best on the collage. And the symbolism will mean something. I'm not yet sure what it means, because, honestly, aesthetics, for me, have to rule over symbolism. Because you can really create symbolism out of absolutely anything and everything. So, the weird thing on my mind today, which is totally unrelated, but since I have to cut out birds, I'm going to talk about it. I was thinking about how traditionally there has been a march of art movements in Western society that are always in dialogue with one another. One art movement will give rise to another, and they're usually based in a sense of conflict. So let's take neoclassicism, for example, and this came about in the late 18th century. We have neoclassicism, which itself is a reaction against the Baroque and Rococo styles of art, which were very much about excessive ornamentation. And, you know, if you think Baroque music, it has a lot of notes. If you think Baroque art and architecture, it has a lot of decorative elements. And neoclassicism emerged as a reaction against that. So we have simpler, straighter lines, less adornment. And you see this in visual art and music. It's what gave rise to Mozart. And, you know, you have simpler melodic lines, a lot fewer, ironically, fewer notes, you know. If you don't take Emperor Joseph II's words to heart, where he said, Mozart, that has too many notes, which he probably didn't say. But anyway, it's still, to our ears, a lot of notes, right? But, you know, at the time, it was simplified stuff from what had come before. And so there you have an art movement that was reacting to a former art movement by going in kind of an opposite direction, or at least a relatively opposite direction. And you have it again when neoclassicism becomes romanticism, essentially. And because neoclassicism came out of the Enlightenment, so there was an emphasis on rational thought. And then there, the new generation of artists in the early 19th century thought that was, too much of an emphasis on rational thought. They would rather have some kind of acknowledgement that they have feelings and that feelings are important. So art and music of the early 19th century and really all of the 19th century became about romanticism, about the expression of emotions. And emotions were expressed in art anyway, like always have been to some degree, but it was a cultural shift. And cultural shifts give rise to artistic shifts. So where am I going with this? Well, this kind of pattern kept going for a very long time. Artistic movements would react to the former artistic movements and become rebellions against them a lot of the time, until we get to what a lot of people call the very last art movement. And that was the pattern and decoration art movement of the 1970s and 80s. And the pattern and decoration art movement was a reaction against minimalism. And minimalism was the aesthetic that had taken the art world by storm in like the 1960s or so. And that was what all good art was expected to be, was minimalistic. And all of this art was also mostly made by men, by white men. And that was the kind of art that the gallery said, this is actual real art, this minimalism stuff. And so there were a lot of women who rebelled against that idea and said, the art that women make is generally nothing like this. The art that women make tends to be, things like this. Women were more involved in the decorative arts, like embroidery, sewing, pottery, things that you would use in your home. Women tended to make that stuff. Even in the 18th century, when patterns were made manually, they were block printed on cloth, and the people who would paint those designs on the cloth were all women. There were whole warehouses full of women, like in France in the 18th century, who would be painting these kinds of patterns directly onto the cloth after they'd been block printed on them. So for a long time, this is the kind of thing women did. And because women did it, it was not considered to be art. And so the pattern and decoration movement of the 70s and 80s tried to change that by making fine art that was really in this kind of style. It's just a lot of pattern. Some people call it wallpaper art because it still often doesn't have the best reputation. And so, but they were just trying to make a point that, the minimalist art that you love so much has been this aesthetic that has denied women from getting into the fine art industry. But the reason that was the last art movement was because shortly thereafter, the internet showed up. And, TV was already taking over. TV was just getting more and more widespread. Color television was getting more and more widespread. And as I had talked about before, in how technology tends to get people more into minimalism to prevent sensory overwhelm. Pattern and decoration was moving in the other direction. Anyway, I digress. I'm just babbling as I cut birds after all. But once the internet shows up, we really don't have art movements anymore. That, at least not in the sense that we had them because there can be no reacting to former art movements when we are experiencing all of humanity's art all at the same time, whenever we want to. Then suddenly, all art becomes valid depending on your taste, and the art that you make in response to that art is a lot more personal. It's much more based in personal taste. The audience you find for that art has their own personal taste, and there's no longer this idea that art has to be this, where this kind of art is so much better than this kind of art. We have a vast opening up of what constitutes art. And these debates have been going on for a long time. I'm an art history major, so I still get really annoyed when someone asks, is this art? It's like, that was the first conversation we had in every single class that I took in my entire art history major. What is art? It's like, oh my God, I'm so tired and bored of this question. Anyway, so the internet comes up and basically says, whatever you like and call art is art. And we don't need to be reacting to other art movements all the time anymore to try to validate our one true art, because there is no one true art. What this means, however, on like a soul evolutionary kind of a path, because I'm woo and I'm strange and I believe in reincarnation because I remember things. And what's interesting is that I've always seen someone's intense interest in one particular historical era's art as being just a smoking gun, that they had a lifetime in that era, in that time and place. That made total sense to me. That's what tipped me off to my former lives, is like, I really enjoy the aesthetics of the late 18th century. I am clearly from there. What will happen, though, with future generations who are currently alive and getting all of their art from the internet, from this vast cultural soup of times and places where they can pick and choose the arts that they find exciting? What if someone now got really into early music? And granted, they're probably really into early music because they had a lifetime somewhere in like the 16th century, 17th century or something. And so, this isn't a mutually exclusive kind of idea. But, okay, let's take this for example. There's a kid today who's really into grunge. Maybe they had a lifetime in the 1990s. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they just really like grunge. But then they're born again in a future lifetime, and once again they find a deep affinity for grunge music, and that leads them to think, oh, I must have had a lifetime in the 1990s. Turns out they didn't. They were just really into the music of the 1990s in the 2020s. And I just wonder, is that going to throw people off in their understanding of who they were when they were in other lifetimes? And I know that is just probably a fairly useless pondering. I mean, really, who sits around and thinks about that kind of stuff? I'm just sharing that because that's the kind of thing I sit around and think about while I'm cutting out birds. Because I'm weird that way. And thought you might be curious. What does this strange lady think about when she cuts out birds? Well, the answer is equally strange thoughts. But maybe that'll make you think too. This is what happens when you get off your phone and let yourself space out or do these weird mindless tasks like cutting out birds. You have strange thoughts. And honestly, I think our world needs a lot more strange thoughts. I think it would help. So that's my encouragement to you today. Take some time away from your phone, space out, think some weird thoughts and share them. So it becomes this feedback loop. So when people are on their phone again, they'll experience your weird thoughts. And they too will be inspired to get off their phone and think their own weird thoughts. And that is my ramble for today. Hope you enjoyed that. by the way, if you enjoy any of these things, feel free to join my mailing list at julianabrandon.com, where it'll prompt you to sign up. All right. Thanks for listening.